Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today and coming to see my little presentation. I am super excited to talk about a product that we use at my organization, Children International. But before I get too far ahead of myself, my name is Tamara Copple. A lot of people call me Tam because that's just much easier. Most people know someone with my name and they pronounce it 10 different ways. So Tamara or Tam, either one is just fine. I am a product owner at Children International. And a couple of disclaimers. First, this is going to be a user experience focused presentation because although I'm getting used to and getting more familiar with the back end of the tool, I'm not going to be able to answer a lot of the really detailed technical questions about it. Don't let that stop you from asking them though, because I can always take them back to my dev team and get answers and then respond back to the group, and Sharon and Jonathan can help me figure out how to do that um, most effectively with you. Be happy to get the answers. Second, Children International is exactly what it sounds like. We are a child data heavy organization. So instead of doing a live demo of the app and put child data at risk, I've taken some screenshots and I've done a couple of movie clips so that you can actually see how this works. And just disclaimer, the data in the clips is all dummy data, so we are not exposing any kids' information. So first, who is Children International? We are a humanitarian organization that aims to create a world without poverty, where every child and family and community is connected, productive, and thriving. Working together with supporters, we invest in the lives of our children and youth and build healthy environments that they need to thrive and empower them to create lasting change in their own lives and communities. We have agencies in Latin America, in India, in Africa, and in the Philippines. To set the stage for what I'm going to show you, we really need to go back a little bit to 2019. At that time, Children International was only partly digital. We had started our digital transformation, but we were not fully matured in that yet. When sponsors wrote to their kids through their online account, which we called MyCI, we could deliver the sponsor's letter digitally to the agencies. But once it got local to the agencies, the kids had to handwrite their responses back, and those were couriered by hard copy back into the United States for digital scanning and processing. And eventually, we would upload them back into the sponsor's MyCI account, and then you would get a follow up in the mail with the actual original letter from the child. And this is an example of one of those letters. This came from my sponsored child back in 2019. And in this case, you can see that he had handwritten the letter, but to get the translation at the bottom of it and to get the second page scanned in, there were a lot of interim steps. First of all, I had to sign up to be a sponsor, in which case it put the information for my sponsorship into our CRM system, and then prepared a record that told the agency, hey, we need a letter from Mrs. Copple. The agency then had to go into the CRM system called Aptify and get a list of all of the kids who needed to produce letters for their respective sponsors. They had to get all of those kids to come into the community center to handwrite the letter and then courier it back to Kansas City. We entered the translation, actually I should say field staff entered the translations through an SSRS tool. So back in Kansas City, we had to match up the physical copies of the letters with the translations in SSRS, combine the two, rescan them, upload it, very many steps along the way and lots of opportunities for error. So there were a lot of systems involved, lots of energy in assembling all of this. And then 2020 and COVID happened. Right away, all of the community centers shut down. So first off, we had no way of delivering sponsor letters to the kids, so they didn't know that their sponsors were writing to them. and the kids couldn't come to the community centers to write their letters. So we needed to find a way to manage all of this digitally. On the right hand side, you'll see a picture of my account and the child that I was writing to at the time. And there's a gap, and you can see that going at the bottom from 2019 through like March 24, 2020, I was getting pretty regular communication from my sponsored child. And then there is a gap of like a year and 3 months where nothing happened. And that was this black hole period where we had no way of getting letters back and forth. So tasks that had been inefficient before were completely unmanageable now. We needed a 100% digital solution, and so really needed to accelerate this digital transformation. The goal of the project was to decrease the amount of time that it took to collect and deliver letters, enable our field staff to work from anywhere using browser capabilities, and to drastically reduce the number of systems involved, which would reduce the context switching, which in turn would increase all of the efficiency. So this was how we ultimately came around to using Power Platform. And God bless our vice president at the time. He was new to the organization. He said, just experiment with it and see what we can do. This potentially offers us really rapid market entry into doing this digital transformation. Just see what you can do with it. And that's where we started. So, the answer to all these pandemic problems was what we now call DigiCorr. DigiCorr is a Canvas app that sits on top of a Cosmos DB database and consolidates data about child correspondence from two different CRM systems, our legacy, which is Aptify, and Dynamics 365, which is a topic of another day entirely, and facilitates all of that letter collection and management. And the flow for that looks something like this. So let's say that I sign up to sponsor a child. Part of that is me going in to create my online account with children.org. It's called MyCI. And I'm going to manage my sponsorship, my account payment options. I can write to my child. I can send them a digital greeting card. I can upload photos and send that to them. As part of becoming a sponsor, we're recording that relationship in our CRM system. And that begins a cycle of letter writing or pen pal writing that goes for the duration of my sponsorship. There are four kinds of letters that are most frequently requested. A welcome letter when the sponsorship is first initiated, a participation letter, which happens about every 6 months or so. If I choose to write to my child, then that would have the child would reply back to me. So that's called sponsor correspondence. And then one final letter, a graduation letter, when that youth turns 19 years old and hopefully graduates, ideally, into the workforce or onto college. So there are multiple opportunities. And I want to pause for a moment and just add a bit of context here. Letter writing as a pen pal activity, the way we think of it in the United States, does not exist in countries like Colombia, like Guatemala, like Lusaka. They don't understand what it means to write to someone, and therefore the kids, that becomes a skill that they learn. Learning to write to someone that they've never met and tell them a little bit about their lives and what's going on in their world. For most of the kids, the idea of getting a letter from their sponsor is the highlight of their month. They love hearing from their sponsors. Unfortunately, we have way fewer sponsors who write to their kids than the kids who are required to write as part of their sponsorship back to their sponsors. So a lot of times it turns out to be one-way communication from the kids to the sponsors rather than it becoming this back and forth relationship between the two. So just a note, if you ever find yourself in that position, your sponsored child would love to hear from you directly. I'm off my soapbox. So I've I have written to my child. I've written to them digitally by sending an email through myci.org. That comes into one of our two systems. We're in the process of retiring Aptify and slowly migrating everything over to Dynamics 365, which is why we have two at the moment. But either way, an overnight batch job does a REST call to an Azure function to load Cosmos DB with the very latest information, all of the letter requests and so on and so forth. And the next day, field staff can go into DigiCorr and see what new letters arrived, what new letter requests arrived overnight, what information might have changed. The field staff will then, through several different means, they will go solicit a response from the child, or if the child's not able to write, one of their family members. Typically, pre-pandemic, like I said, they were handwriting. Since the pandemic, the vast majority of information comes in through WhatsApp, which never took off in the US, but has apparently taken off everywhere else in the world. Our families are on extremely limited data plans that they prepay for. So they very judiciously have to dole out their responses to text messages. They may handwrite a letter and take a photograph of it and return it to Children International, but it's all coming in digitally now through WhatsApp or through text messages, rarely through email. Most families don't have email addresses. They have prepaid phones with limited data plans. So the agencies will collect all that data from the children. They'll assemble it in DigiCorr. They'll preview the letter, which I'll show you in a minute. They'll preview that letter, say, I've completed it, and then wait 24 hours. And we have a second batch job that listens for letters that have been completed. And on a daily basis, we'll collect everything that is older than about 24 hours old. And there's a reason for that I'll get into. And then completes those letters, turning them into a PDF file, which we load into SharePoint. And then our print production processes can pick up and deliver back into MyCI. And then we can send an email to the sponsor and say, hey, you've got a letter coming in the mail, but you could also just go look at it online right now. So we have resumed the ability to do that two-step delivery, both online by scanning that letter digitally and delivering by USPS, unless a sponsor doesn't care for hard copy, in which case we can turn it off. If key information changes, like a child address or a sponsor cancels, which does happen, so that letter isn't needed anymore, our batch jobs overnight will also make those updates to the child's record so that the field staff is always working with information that is no more than about 24 hours old. So before I go on to the demo part of this, I want to pause and ask if anyone has any questions. No? Okay,
Nothing in chat.
nothing in chat. This is going to go super fast. Okay, so let's see how this actually works. If I am one of my agency staff, I am going to go to a vanity URL for DigiCorr that we have assigned and goes to our secured Power Apps application. And the first thing it's going to do is recognize that I'm an authorized user and log me in. We're using Active Directory for this with security groups that determine who gets what level of access. All of the child data that we have is located in this one database. Excuse me. So having those security groups limits the user so that they can only see the kids within their own agency. Got a bit of a tickle in my throat. The next screen that is presented to me is this wonderful multi-featured search capability screen. As field staff, I may be responsible for up to 3,000 kids, and all of them have letters due. The question is, how many of them have letters that are due this week? Where are those kids located? So I can use this robust set of search criteria to narrow my list of kids that I want to work with down into just what I want to see or work with today. One of the ways that we use these search features is to create a list of kids who live in a single neighborhood and who have letters that are due within the next week to 2 weeks. And we export that list and provide it to our community volunteers. And our community volunteers, who are generally speaking moms, are going out to the neighborhoods and collecting the letters from the kids. Now, how do they do this? We at CI help to buy a little bit of a boost in data plan usage for these volunteer moms. They have the same limited flip phone and smartphone service that others have. So we give them a bit of a stipend to help boost their data plans. And they'll actually hand their phone to a child and say, type your message in here. And they've been trained on how to submit the letter properly. And they'll hand the phone to the child, and the child will type their message in. And then maybe they'll take a picture of a handwritten letter. And then the volunteer is the one who will send that back to Children International. Why is that? Not every family can afford to have a cell phone. But in the countries that we do work in, that cell phone is a lifeline to everything else. During the pandemic, for example, I keep coming back to the data plans. During the pandemic, you might have a family with a single smartphone and a limited data plan, and they were trying to provide school capabilities to 4 kids on nothing more than the equivalent of an old iPhone. So it makes us very conscious as we're talking about collecting data digitally that this is a brand new experience for people who don't have computers in their homes. They're a little wary of technology, so we need to make this as easy a process as we can. They don't have much data to be able to use, so we need to be extremely cognizant of what is the minimum amount of data and how can we strip that down to the minimum number of bytes possible so that we're not taxing their limited resources. And where possible, we're enabling our community volunteers to help lighten that burden by supplementing their own data plans so that they can be collecting this information. So all of this comes back to, this is why I need this much capability, this much flexibility in changing these, in changing my criteria around. Something to notice right off the bat is in the top right-hand corner, we can flip back and forth between English and Spanish names. So this was one of our early enhancements. We made label names for all of the major screens so that our Spanish speaking agencies could work with this tool in their own language. In the Philippines, in India, in Lusaka, there are so many different dialects that there's most of them speak in English. English is the language of business, is the language of communication when you have so many dialects in play. But in Latin America, even though there are some contextual differences, like for example, in England, they call the bathroom the loo, right? There's a slightly different name for a word in Ecuador than there is in Colombia, than there is in the Dominican Republic. So we try to account for the majority of that with titles that will work everywhere, but we couldn't get that level of detail our with our Asian partners, so we concentrated just on Spanish, and that gets probably about 60 to 70% of our users. So here we are on the English screen. Not only do I have all of these different available options for narrowing down a list of work, but I can also do an individual search at the top. I can type in a child's first name, their last name, a correspondence ID, or a child ID, any one of those different 4 criteria, and I can go immediately to the record that I want to work with. So you don't necessarily have to spend 5 or 10 minutes cycling yourself into a finite list of records. When I am satisfied with all of the criteria, and in this case, I've just selected a community center, a zone, and a sector, which a sector is basically a neighborhood in this context, I have a couple of different options. I can either clear the filter because I've messed something up and I want to try again. I can go to show a list of all of the records that meet this criteria, and I'll show that in a minute. Or I can specifically select columns that I want to export, and that looks like this. If I am the field staff and I want to provide a list of kids that need correspondence in a particular sector, I'm going to narrow down that list and give that volunteer exactly the information that they need. I'm going to click export, and this will download a CSV file to my personal OneDrive that I can then open. It automatically converts to Excel in that process, and I can provide that to the volunteer for them to work. If I go back to the show list option down here in this portion, it brings me to this screen, which is our filtered list view. Now, this screen allows us to do several things. First, I can actually see how many records meet this criteria that I just selected on, and I can eyeball it to see if it's correct. But sometimes, if I'm looking at a community center level, for example, there may be 2,000 kids that come up in this search criteria, but I don't want to show them all at once. I mean, functionally, I can't actually do much with a list of 2,000 kids at one time. I'm going to be paginating through them to see what happens. So in this case, not only do we have an actual overall record count, but we have the ability to page back and forth one at a time. What this allows us to do is increase the speed of the application by recognizing that we are going to pull back 2,000 records, but we actually only load the first 50 or so, and then queue up the next 50 after that, just in case that person wants to paginate. And then if they select, let's go to page 2 of 10, right? They'll click to the next page, and the backend will queue up the next 50 records for us. So we found that that really increased the efficiency of the application, because people didn't who will routinely select criteria that give them back a couple thousand results. It helps them to be viewable, to helps those results be viewable much faster, and in turn makes the staff more productive because they're not sitting there waiting on the app to churn and present them with 2,000 records. Another thing that I can do in this screen is I can bulk assign these records either to field staff, or there's another option in here to assign them to a translator. The bulk assignment introduces another area of efficiency by saving me from having to go into each one of these records and individually click and save that record and come back out and click and save the next record, and so on and so forth. So bulk assignment was another early enhancement that we did after we got the first iteration of this tool out the door. Once I have done everything that I need to in this, you don't see it on this particular screenshot, but we do have audit history out there as well, so we can track changes when someone goes in and makes a change to a record. But when I'm ready, I can click on this blue hyperlink, and that will take me into a child's detail. This is basically an overview screen, and again, this is dummy data, not to worry. We have basic information about the child here, about where they live, and the field staff can make sure that they're actually working with the correct child and the correct information, because usually there's a lot of name repetition. So if they go into a record, they want to make sure that they're actually matching up the right name with the right sponsor. The real magic actually happens when I click that edit button. And this is where the bulk of the work is done. So in this case, there's a lot happening on this screen. In the top right-hand corner, this is a minimized header section. There are actually about 3 more rows worth of required and locked data that describes this child's record. It's locked because they don't need to be changing it. They don't need to be changing the child's name or the sponsor's name or the correspondence ID. And I've minimized it here for safety purposes. But the other thing that this correspondence status will show is, where is this letter at in its life cycle? In this case, this letter has been received, but as soon as I want to work with it, I have some options. I can assign it to myself, or I can assign it to someone else. I can add content to it. I can assign it to a translator. I can add notes, and I'm going to show you all that in just a moment here. Go ahead and do that. This is one of the screen clips that I was talking about. In this case, we've got this letter that is in a status of received, and I can either start typing in a name of someone in my agency, or I can stop and assign it to myself. So I'm going to clear out that name here and assign to self. And you'll note that it does a couple of things. It also automatically updated the assigned to field staff, and it updated the date assigned. So I don't have to think about adding all those details in. It automatically registered that this changed for me. And this is just on a loop. So that's what that is. It's going back and showing that again. Assigned to field staff or assigned to self. Another cool feature about this app is that we have the ability to accommodate non-Western alphabets. In our case, we have multiple South Asian dialects, and in our India agencies, we can support Urdu, Bangla, and the Hindi alphabets. We've found that little touches like being able to see the child's own alphabet, which you wouldn't think about if you were just writing to someone here in the US, but understanding that this child actually thinks in a different dialect, in a different alphabet than the one that we use, is part of making that experience authentic for us as sponsors. So in this case, we're also using Microsoft Translator on that right-hand box, and I'll demonstrate that in a minute. We're using Microsoft Translator version 2 to automatically translate the child's reply. Translator does not have the capability of translating Urdu, Bangla, or Hindi very well, absolute minimal capabilities. And there are at least 3 dialects that Lusaka uses that it doesn't even have context for at all. It's not even there. So primarily our Microsoft Translator tool would be available to our Spanish speaking agency. So there's opportunity for improvement there, but unfortunately not something that Children International ourselves can push. That's something that's got to come from Microsoft. So this is another one of those screen clips, and in this case, I have assigned a letter to myself, and I have pasted in some text from a child's submission from WhatsApp. I can see that I have used 4 lines of text, and I can also choose whether or not this letter was written by the participant or by someone else in the family. So in this case, I'm going to make sure that I have selected English as the language that I want to translate into, and I'm going to click the translate button. And instantaneously it has come up with text. And this is just going to loop and do that again while I talk. A couple of things for you here. This number 4 gives us an idea of how many lines the child has written, and it directly correlates to the number of lines available on our template to be able to fill. I think we're up to 31 lines of text that a child can write. And the reason that this is important is because some agencies like to use their pagination breaks or their line breaks. So they will put a partial line of text, enter, another partial line of text, enter, and that eats up space that we could be putting in a letter. We started out by using character counts, and we were able to accommodate up to 975 characters, but we found that even so, kids were writing more text than we could accommodate. And so even after we changed to a monospace font so that we could accurately predict how many characters we could fit on a page. We still had a lot of letter text being cut off, so we moved to count by line instead. And then we've tried to retrain the agencies to be a little more judicious with their use of line breaks, but we've ultimately gone on to have two-page letters, and that makes this somewhat easier. But I do want to point out Microsoft Translator is not perfect. This is the original text in Spanish. This part is what Microsoft Translator provided, and this is actually the original text of the letter. So in this case, we can see that the child's name is Miguel, but it was translated to Michelangelo. Not great. In the original letter, he says, I am diligent. Microsoft Translator says, I am applied, which sounds awkward at best. And then in the original translated text, this was hand translated by a field staff. It is the rainy season, and Microsoft Translator missed the article the in between the two. So even in just a tweet sized letter text, there's already 3 errors in it. And this is why after the first several weeks of trying this in production, the feedback that we got from the field was we're spending more time correcting Microsoft Translator than we are just typing it in to begin with. We're going to stop using this feature. So we have it still there in the tool if someone wants to use it, but it's got a long ways to go. So it's there, but it's not being used to the fullest capability that we would like to see it used. Okay, so in this case, I have completed the letter. I've actually added a photograph that I want to send with this letter. I'm going to click preview, and I can instantaneously see in an HTML preview what this letter is going to look like when the field staff, have saved this. What this gives me is the ability to see, oh, this child had a little more space to write. I'm going to go back and contact the family and see if they want to add to their letter. Or they know they hadn't been able to get the entire text on and they see they can add a little more of the child's letter to it. All of this is to help them make sure that they're producing as much of the child's original text and reply as they can. So what happens in this case is we produce the preview, and once we're satisfied with the preview, the user can just click save and complete the record, and then it's going to pause and wait. And I'm just, whoops, hang on. What did I just do? I think I just got out of my presentation. It's going to pause and for 24 hours, wait until the child's letter has aged a bit. And the reason that we do that is so that we can um, make sure that there are no last minute changes, because now and then the field staff will realize, oh wait, I think I may have gotten this translation wrong. I want to make sure that this is correct. So they will come back to this and make some last minute changes. Once that letter has aged to about 24 hours or so, that's when our second batch job will pick it up and take that HTML preview, which was saved in an Azure Blob storage, They'll take that preview, create a PDF out of it, deliver it to SharePoint, and then our print production facility can pick it up. And the letter is already digitally most of the way there. And all they have to do is upload it to the sponsor's account. So I'm going to reshare here just a moment and going to stop, present, get back into Teams. Okay. This is what happens when you hit escape instead of next. All right, and I'm going to get myself back in place. This is the one example of a Power Automate flow that I wanted to show. Again, I'm not the technical expert on this, but I'm showing it to say that there's a whole process that ends up using Power Automate and REST calls and Azure functions and other other jobs as well that necessitate developer involvement. So this really is a robust app that just goes beyond the single page app that we see advertised all of the time. So the ability to create an HTML preview and save that file in Azure Blob Storage has really been a game changer for us. Letting the agency staff see what that final letter is going to look like before they ever deliver it to Kansas City has allowed them to really improve on the quality and make sure that they're getting all the right information from the child. So, pros and cons that we've discovered since we've gone through this. First of all, huge cost savings. Whereas previously, agency staff had to travel to the neighborhoods, usually with their own cars on their own dime. They had to travel out to the neighborhoods, spend time collecting the letters from the families, printing and mailing them, sending them back to Kansas City by courier. All of that is saved because now we can do this digitally if we need to. Community centers have since reopened. Since about 2021, most of them have been reopened, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's convenient for kids to come to the community center. Some of them are in pretty rural districts where it's not, I'm going to say it's not safe for them to come to the community center for a couple of reasons. The first one is we specialize in working in places where there are extremely depressed conditions. That also tends to have gang violence go hand in hand with it. So the kids may not be safe in leaving their neighborhood where their gaggle of local moms are watching out for them. I was recently in Guatemala, had the privilege of going down there to see our agency in Guatemala. And the first thing that struck me is that the roads were extremely narrow and all of the vehicles from trucks to cars to motorcycles are much, much smaller in general there. And there were no shoulders. There were no safe sidewalks on, along the highways for the kids to be able to walk on. So if they were in a community that's a little farther flung, they cannot safely come to the community center without purchasing some kind of transportation. And if your family's choice is between purchasing um, a tuk-tuk ride into town or getting food that day, getting food is the pretty clear choice. So anything that we can do to make this process a little bit more to- um, palatable for our families, a little easier on them, is something that we want to try and do because we're here to help make their lives better, not to make it more inconvenient for them. So, additionally, flexible UI options. Really, we looked into doing, I've seen now with the development of our Microsoft Dynamics tool, model driven apps being built for those other purposes and have been able to compare what that experience is like versus the flexibility of being able to develop our own UI in Canvas apps. And the users love this app. We did have the benefit of having a UX designer in the very beginning, early stages, and luckily we haven't had to do a lot of major revisions to it since then. The users love the clarity, they love the size of the buttons, they love the speed with which they can get information back, they love how it's presented, it makes sense, it's intuitive. There's very little training that has to be done to train them how to use this tool. It is very close to plug and play. It's also very scalable. When we started this, we anticipated we would do somewhere around 450,000 letters a year among all the different letter types that we support. About 450,000 letters a year. Now that we're out of the pandemic and Children International is scaling up operations, we are already set up for success. And Nothing has to change with this app because of things like the pagination that we've put in. Nothing has to change for us to be able to handle an exponentially bigger size volume. We have faster time to delivery because we can go back and forth, and with texts, with WhatsApp for example, we can get responses more quickly from the families and communicate with them. It's also helped us with standardization. Every agency had their own version of this process to somehow get a letter to Kansas City. And since we have introduced DigiCorr, most of the agencies are using a very similar process. There will always be a bit of contextualization based on where you happen to be in the world at the time, but this has made us a lot closer in standardizing the processes. And then also importantly, many fewer systems. Whereas they had to deal with, upwards of 5 or 6 systems previously before in the before times. Now a field staff user only has to go into DigiCorr to call up today's information that they want to work with, export it, and send it on. So we've reduced it from, say, 6 or 7 down to 3 if they choose, like DigiCorr, Excel if they want to use it that way, and maybe WhatsApp if they want to deliver that way. So they've got a lot of more flexibility, and that too has contributed to cost savings. Cons to this process, the big one has been Microsoft Translator, because as of the reasons I showed you, it's not the best tool at actually getting the right context for that particular country. And number two, this has long since stopped being low code. I know that that is the selling point of Canvas apps, and I see how that happens. But to make all of the wonderful things happen in this app, and to make it talk to 2 different CRM systems, and to be able to store photo data, for example, that goes beyond our Excel user capability. We need developers for this. We have a team of 4. We have a technical lead who does a little bit of everything. We have someone who is best with JavaScript, someone who is best with the UI front end, and we have someone who is best with the back end batch processes. And each one of them, it takes a team effort, and all of them have to talk to one another, but each one of them being strong in their own particular areas is what makes this app work all together. So, impact on us. Pre-pandemic, we were partially digital. We had a very painful process. It partially used a SharePoint solution that actually, when we entered into the pandemic, the partially digital transformation that we had achieved ended up becoming unmanageable because it actually took twice as long to collect a letter as it did pre-pandemic. So whether you go by those standards or the ones pre-pandemic, we've increased our efficiency and decreased time to produce a letter by about 75%. The time that it takes to create a letter is a lot of sitting and waiting to get a response back from a child, or waiting for Kansas City to print and mail the letter. Those are areas where there's just natural stops in the flow. But for a person who has all of that information at hand, a child's reply and maybe a photo of the letter, they could complete that letter as fast as they can translate it. That's the only thing that would slow them down. So um, once we started exploring a low code alternative, we didn't know what that would look like, and our vice president just turned us loose and said, "Go wild, figure out what you can do with this." And with that creative freedom and the technical shackles taken off, the team really pushed the boundaries, and we've been able to figure out some partially CI/CD pipeline improvements that we can make. Our actual UI itself, we now call CI/CD, because you could just push a button and push the solutions out into production. Now, if we have to do batch processes and things like that, those are not exactly CI/CD yet, but from the perspective of someone who's constantly trying to deliver continuous improvement, continuously deliver, that back end technical functionality that the developers have built in have really allowed us to push out enhancements just at the rate of, a couple a month. And we could go even faster than that depending on how fast a developer can get a feature ready. So we have that capability, and the agencies love it. They love coming into the app and going, "Oh my gosh, this new thing happened. This wasn't here before. This is so cool." And we'll hear the other side of it too. "Hey, this thing stopped working overnight." And then of course we have to scramble, but it's not perfect, but we are pretty pleased with the outcomes of that. And now, and I think the best testament of all is the fact that other areas of the organization, seeing the success of DigiCorr, have actually started trying to build their own. And now they're coming to my team and saying, "Hey, I've got this thing that I kind of sort of built, but it doesn't work exactly the way I wanted to. Can you help me fix it?" And that is exactly what we want to have happen. We want to empower users to come up with their own use cases for this, and to be able to come to us and consult. It introduced a really good kind of a problem because our entire focus is on this one application. And now, if we are going to be the subject matter experts on Power Platform in general, that kind of changes the dimensions of the team and where we might be able to go with it in very cool and exciting ways. So we are expecting to scale up within the next year or so to about 500,000 letters a year. So, like I said, scalability is really important to us. And now that we're actually looking into this, we're seeing a lot more opportunities. And it's a case of, now that I can see what this can do, what else could we do? So, one of the ways that I think we could introduce some efficiencies is, instead of having the field staff have to go out and solicit a family, if they just send a hyperlink and say, "Hey, please send us your response," maybe those families can enter their own responses and add their own pictures, and those show up in DigiCorr without the field staff having to take that step of manually adding them themselves. We have planned to do some reporting and monitoring with Power BI. How many agencies are fulfilling 100% on time and on schedule, right? How many agencies are having issues? Where do we have problems with fulfillment consistently, so that we can begin to recognize patterns and take advantage of opportunities, especially training opportunities. Up to now, it's been very much a knee jerk, "Hey, this problem happened." It would be really great if we had a report going forward that would tell us if these two things are out of sync, so that we can address it before it becomes a big issue. But I'd like to get us to the place where we're actually doing that proactively rather than reactively. Improved translation capabilities is something that we're keeping an eye on. We've looked at DeepL, which is what our programs used for a lot of their formal translation. um, it has fewer languages, but the languages that it uses have better overall translation capabilities. We've also looked at Google Translator, but in field tests, Google Translator actually performed worse. So this is an ongoing exploratory sort of a thing for us. And then ultimately, as we finish our legacy migration from Aptify into Dynamics 365, which, like I said, is the topic of an entirely different conversation. Once we finish that, we're looking at converting the database from Cosmos DB into Dataverse, which will give us more flexibility in actually integrating with D365. And then we are always looking for ways to enhance content monitoring for child safety. You'd be surprised the number of people who say, "Let me give you my address," and thinking that the child is going to actually come visit them. Or they will say, "Hey, can we exchange Facebook handles or Instagram handles?" That constitutes direct contact. And anything that is not supervised between the adult and the child poses a risk. While 99% of sponsors and kids have great intentions, there could always be a bad actor somewhere in there and puts either the child or the sponsor at risk. For example, a family who preys on the sponsor's kind-heartedness to say, "Hey, can you send me a little extra money this month? I'm going to use it for tuition for my child," and then they don't. They use it for something nefarious, right? It can go both ways. So, simply to say, we do want to we do want to monitor the content of both kids replies to their sponsors and sponsors communication with their kids for appropriateness. Right now we're doing that in a semi automated, semi manual way. There's an R process that runs kind of outside of the system that flags for certain words, and if anything gets flagged, it gets kicked into a manual review queue where someone else actually reviews the whole context. What if we could have an AI do that? What about a large language model? What are our opportunities there? Could we train a more sophisticated model than just a red flag list of words that we update every few months or so? Always going to be something that we consider. Okay, so one last slide here. Here's all my contact information. I would love it if you would click on children.org and check us out to read the stories. They are such heart and inspiring stories. I get choked up. I will go out periodically and look for our kids that need to be sponsored, and they are the reason that I love my job. I get the privilege of actually being able to make a positive change in the world. With that, I will stop and ask if there is any questions and then just say, hey, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or hit me up on email if you have any specific questions.